Good evening. I am Dr. Anil Parikh, President, Medical Affairs and Clinical Research, Ipca. It's a great pleasure to me to welcome all the medical fraternity across the country who have joined for this webinar, and we have an academic feast waiting for us because we have three very distinguished international speakers for this meeting, as well as a very distinguished panel from India, all leading authorities. So it's my pleasure to first introduce the first speaker for today's meeting, Professor William Cushman. I think the theme of this symposium is 20 years of ALLHAT study, the landmark and the largest hypertension trial involving almost 42,400 patients and followed up for a long time. So this trial is going to remain for a foreseeable future to be the largest hypertension trial. And Dr. William Cushman has been also involved in the ALLHAT study. He's been the principal investigator. He is medical director, Department of Preventive Medicine and Professor of Preventive Medicine and Physiology at the University of Tennessee Health Sciences Center. And also the Dean faculty at the University of Mississippi. In fact, I have been fortunate to meet him at University of Mississippi Cardiorenal Conference, although he may not recall, when we presented the first ARB with Chlorthalidone study at the Cardiorenal Conference way back in 2008. And he was on the NHLBI JNC 7 committee, JNC 8 committee, US Hypertension Guidelines committee, and has been a veteran affairs champion for a long time and has been involved in many studies including studies on Chlorthalidone. And he has been the investigator for many clinical trials on hypertension, which are sponsored by NHLBI like ALLHAT, ACCORD, SPRINT, and many industry-funded trials. Currently, he is co-chair of the Diuretic Comparison Project, which is again a veteran affairs cooperative study comparing the thiazide type diuretic Chlorthalidone with hydrochlorothiazide, which is very, very eagerly awaited. He has published almost more than 350 journal articles and book chapters and received several awards. So we have Professor William Cushman with us, and we welcome him. Next, after William, Dr. William Cushman is going to speak on ALLHAT relevance today. The next speaker we have is Professor Jackson Wright, and we are familiar with him because he has visited us and he has enriched us on the SPRINT study 3 years ago. And he is going to speak on ALLHAT relevance today. He has been Emeritus Professor of Medicine and Emeritus Director of William T. Dahms. He is MD Clinical Research Unit at the University Hospitals and Clinical Hypertension Program at the Division of Nephrology and Hypertension, and has received both MD and PhD pharmacology from the University of Pittsburgh and internal medicine residency at the University of Michigan. Over 300 publications and served on many national and international advisory panel. And Dr. Wright has had a major leadership role in many major clinical outcome trials on hypertension, cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, and especially those conducted in Black populations over the past 2.5 decades. And has been the principal investigator of SPRINT study very, very notably. So we welcome Dr. Jackson Wright for today's session. Next, we have with us Professor Paul Whelton, who has been very, very notable and well known all over the medical fraternity across the globe because of he has been the main writer of the 2017 ACC AHA guideline, and he's going to speak to us on ALLHAT relevance tomorrow. He has spent over 26 years at Johns Hopkins University as a faculty member in medicine, nephrology, and epidemiology, and served at Tulane University and Dean School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine, Dean School of Medicine, and Senior Vice President of Health Sciences. He has been former President, CEO of Loyola University Health System and Medical Center before returning to Tulane. And he has shared many studies, including the NIH-sponsored TOHF, TON, ALLHAT, SPRINT, etc., and chaired and authored many blood pressure prevention and treatment clinical practice guidelines, including the latest, the most recent 2017 ACC AHA guideline and the 2021 WHO guidelines for the pharmacological treatment of hypertension in adults. He has been the president-elect of the World Hypertension League and recipient of the honorary degree doctorate honors, and he was awarded the AHA Population Research Award and AHA Blood Pressure Council Excellence Hypertension Research Award in 2018 and AHA Distinguished Scientist Award in 2019 and the National Kidney Foundation and David M. Hume Memorial Award in 2021, and published approximately over 550 peer-reviewed manuscripts and 100 book chapters, supplements or monographs. So very, very distinguished person. Then we have to chair today's session, we have with us Dr. Jagdish Hiramat, who is well known, and we are very grateful to him because whenever we request him to come for a CME program, he is always willing and gives us time. He is interventional cardiologist at and director cath lab at Ruby Hall Clinic and chair and professor of preventive cardiology. In fact, Maharashtra University of Health Sciences, and takes a keen interest on hypertension. That's why we is very, very eagerly listened across the country. He's chief cardiologist heart transplant program in Ruby Hall Clinic, Pune, and one of the pioneers of echo Doppler PTCA and heart transplantation in Western India, and honorary editor of Circulation Journal Indian edition, and principal investigator of many clinical trials and studies, and teacher for DM and DNB for past 10 years. So before I hand over to Professor Jagdish Hiramat to start the proceeding, I would just like to brief what we have done at Ipca. As soon as the ALLHAT study was published in December 2002, I was very intrigued in this study, and I think we are the surprisingly where an old molecule like chlorthalidone was compared to at that time newer molecules like calcium channel blocker, amlodipine, the AC inhibitor lisinopril, and the alpha blocker terazosin. And surprisingly, on many secondary endpoints, chlorthalidone came better than the newer drugs. And and when we see as a pharmaceutical company, I think we were the only company to take interest in the ALLHAT study, and we conceived a new 6.25 milligram dose, and a series of studies we showed that it is as good as other antihypertensive drugs in low doses, which we did the study. And then we had the first ARB with chlorthalidone study, which we received the New Investigator Travel Award at University of Mississippi. Then we compared 6.25 chlorthalidone with 12.5 hydrochlorothiazide head-to-head comparison with 24 hours ambulatory blood pressure, and that showed that unlike hydrochlorothiazide, chlorthalidone works throughout 24 hours and control the blood pressure throughout 24 hours. And this study appeared in JACC, and then subsequently we received Clinical and Research Excellence Award for this study. So now I would, since we have a huge agenda, I would request Dr. Jagdish Hiramat to kindly start the proceedings.
Thank you, Dr. Anil. It's a great privilege to be the chair for today's program, and I'm quite excited about the academic feast that is to follow. ALLHAT study nearly 20 years ago emphasized the relevance of many things, especially the use of diuretics in the management of hypertension. And this was a trial which has a major impact on the guidelines, and it changed the prescription pattern of the world related to management of hypertension. It dismantled a lot of farrago related to the management of hypertension in the past, and almost became an apotheosis in the management of hypertension. To cap it all, today we have the original contributors with us, and it's an absolute privilege to have them here, and we'll hear from the masters' voices about what ALLHAT is and what its relevance today and in the future. It is, in fact, shall we say, fortunate epiphenomenon of the pandemic to have such stalwarts with us. It's 9:30, 10:30 on a Sunday morning in US, and I really thank them for sparing their time for us. We also realized from the ALLHAT trial that the combination works very well. We then followed up with other trials which were smaller doses combination, and now majority of the guidelines say that you can start with a combination of ARB diuretic or a calcium channel blocker. I wish the world realized this, and superpowers, if they came combined together, probably it will help the world as well. With this now, I have a pleasant duty of introducing to you to the Indian faculty, Dr. Venkata S. Ram. He is a doyen of cardiology, and after his illustrious career in USA, is now fortunate for us settled in India. He has a large body of original work on hypertension, and he is a torch bearer for the hypertension management of India. All his credentials are very much on the screen. The next teacher we have is Dr. Abhijit Tarafdar. He has exceptionally in this career related to be a professorial and teacher in various stints in prestigious institutions of nephrology in Kolkata, and his rich experience will be of great help for all of us. Dr. V. Mohan, who is what Dr. Venkatram to hypertension is, he is a torchbearer of India for diabetes. Phenomenal achievements that you can see on your screens. He is a clinician, a scientist, and a social philosopher all rolled into one. So it's a great combination. I must congratulate Ipca and for getting such luminaries to this meeting today. And we roll on now, and I hand over the session to Dr. Venkatram.
Thank you. Thank you, JS. We'll proceed with the program. Due to this unusual nature of this program, such introductions were necessary because the pillars of this monumental study ALLHAT are our faculty. I can't think of any other forum globally that can actually have this kind of top leaders assemble under one platform to discuss it. In fact, it's almost impossible, at least in my past life, to get this deadly trio of Paul Whelton and Cushman and Jackson right together on one forum. It's actually, I know that I'm taking some time. It's a dream come true. It is my fortunate privilege that we are able to assemble them for this program. And remembering ALLHAT is really remembering hypertension in 20th and 21st century. So I want to tell all the audience, 5,000 doctors who have tuned in, this is an opportunity that you are unlikely to get in the near future again, where the founders of the study, organizers of the study, analysis, publications, they're all together. And also from our own wonderful South Asia, we have Dr. Abhijit Tarafdar, wonderful nephrologist, clinician, nephrologist par excellence. And then we have Dr. Mohan, who is actually a global leader in cardiometabolic disorders, exemplified by diabetes. All the data from diabetes from India in the last 30 years is because of his contribution, and he has established diabetes clinics all over the country, which is very, very important. I hope the other countries will emulate, probably they do. And Dr. JS Hiramat, he was already introduced. I know him as JS, wonderful clinical cardiologist. He brought fame and name to the city of Pune in medicine. Now Pune is very popular, but in the olden days, when it was just a sister city away from Mumbai, the Hiramat brothers brought prestige to the city in the field of medicine, and they continue to do it. And I should also offer my salutation to Dr. Anil Parikh with Ipca. He's one of the few individuals, I have said before, and I will say it again, industry, clinical pharmacologist, totally dedicated to science and its applications. What happens to a molecule when you apply it, and what happens to the outcome trials when a molecule is administered to the patient, not only cardiovascular disease, but hydroxychloroquine, a number of anti-inflammatory drugs, and he's responsible for discovering to some extent the anti-diabetic effects of hydroxychloroquine. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is a galaxy, and I just want you to pay your attention, enjoy it, experience it, and ultimately we'll all be good learners, good listeners, and make the patients live longer with a healthy life. So let us proceed with the program. The topics have already been announced, so it can be just, they can introduce each other when they do it. So let me ask Dr. Bill Cushman. By the way, I have known Cushman and Whelton and Jackson Wright and all of you throughout my career, which is not on pause, which is still continuing. So Bill, please start the program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ram. Delightful to see you in person here, and let me know if my screen is not showing up. Let's see. Is that working?
Came initially, now the program is up. So maybe this can be removed and.
Very much. So I'm really delighted to be here, and it's great to see a lot of familiar faces and friends. And so I'm going to start out by setting the background for ALLHAT relevance then, 20 years ago, and to remind you that we actually started planning the study 30 years ago in 1992, and we have actually, when we published the initial major results of the 3 drugs in 2002, we had already previously published the doxazosin results, and I'll briefly review those. And we now have over 100 manuscripts, and I know that others have published a lot of the ALLHAT data as well. So there's a tremendous amount out there. But I'm going to start back with the simplicity of where we were and what happened initially. So when ALLHAT was being designed in the early 1990s, most hypertension outcome trials had only used thiazide-type diuretic-based therapy. And in fact, one of the most impressive, the SHEP study, Systolic Hypertension in the Elderly Program, studying chlorthalidone as the diuretic, thiazide-like diuretic, showed a very nice reduction in stroke and cardiovascular events. That was sponsored by the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute in the U.S., who also sponsored the ALLHAT study, and several others that we'll mention this morning or this evening. And so trials with beta blockers had been done, but were very limited in number and quality, and none were conducted in the United States. But the United Kingdom Medical Research Council trial in older adults, a very good study, had just been reported in 1992, and it had shown a benefit for diuretic again, but not for a beta blocker in that study. So the beta blocker studies were mixed, and that one in particular, the beta blocker in older patients, was no better than placebo. And there were no hypertension outcome trials with regimens initiated with other classes, such as calcium blockers or ACE inhibitors. And in fact, the ARBs did not even come on the market until several years later. And so the first of the studies of other drugs was actually the CIS-UR study reported in 1997. So that was 5 years after we designed ALLHAT and 3 years after we started ALLHAT. So this just gives a kind of a summary of from one network meta-analysis, and showing the effect of thiazide-type diuretics. And it says low dose, although this was really the equivalent of at least 50 milligrams of hydrochlorothiazide or 25 of chlorthalidone, because that's what had happened by this point when this meta-analysis was done for the most part. And you can see that all major outcomes were reduced: 20% reduction in coronary disease, 50% reduction in heart failure, 30% reduction in stroke, and even mortality and cardiovascular disease. And so the diuretic clearly was shown to be effective, and certainly when we designed the study, it was the only drug that had consistently been shown to be effective. And despite that, what had happened was that diuretic use went from 50 to 60% in the early 80s down to less than 30% by 1992 when we designed the study. And in fact, the newer classes of calcium blockers and ACE inhibitors had actually now exceeded diuretics as the therapy in hypertension. And then, as you can see, the ARBs didn't come on until later, although they took off and were very popular. And again, the first trial of something besides a diuretic or beta blocker was not published until 1997. And so ALLHAT was developed to try and answer the question of whether these newer classes were better than the diuretics. And we didn't know, and didn't know what to expect when we designed the study. We had no biases on that. But the question was, does treatment with newer agents, calcium blocker, ACE inhibitor, or alpha blocker, and we chose alpha blockers not because it was used as frequently, but because it had beneficial effects on both glucose and lipids. And would they reduce the composite endpoint of fatal coronary heart disease or non-fatal MI, so a CHD endpoint, compared with standard diuretic therapy? And that outcome was selected because that was the reason that many doctors were choosing these other drugs over the diuretic, is that they assumed that they would be better at preventing coronary disease. So ALLHAT was a randomized, double-blind, multi-center clinical trial conducted between 1994 and 2002. The population, as already mentioned, was over 42,000 high-risk hypertensive patients over 55 years of age. And so here's the general algorithm. The majority were previously on antihypertensive drugs, and then they were randomized to either chlorthalidone, amlodipine, lisinopril, or doxazosin. And you can see the numbers there, higher number for chlorthalidone, since each of these were being compared with the chlorthalidone. And you can see the doses. Target dose could up to 25 of chlorthalidone, 10 of amlodipine, 40 of lisinopril, or 8 of doxazosin. And then other drugs from other classes could be added and were provided by ALLHAT, such as atenolol, clonidine, reserpine, or hydralazine. Hydralazine often used as a third step to try and get blood pressures below 140/90. And this was the first major trial that actually had that as a goal, as part of the therapy. And we achieved about 70% of patients were below 140/90. So after a 3-year average follow-up, the alpha blocker arm was stopped early because of a substantial difference in outcomes. Primarily this 20% higher rate of cardiovascular disease, but almost twice as much heart failure and 26% more stroke in the alpha blocker arm. That probably would not be worse than placebo, but it clearly was not nearly as good as the other drugs at that point. And then a few years later, then we continued the study till the end, and then the amlodipine and lisinopril results were looked at compared with chlorthalidone. And with all three of these classes of drugs, none of the outcomes were superior for the newer drug compared with chlorthalidone. For the amlodipine, it actually did pretty well. Coronary events were similar, the primary endpoint, all-cause mortality and stroke, but heart failure was almost 40% higher with the amlodipine. And of course, now we have a lot of data knowing that calcium blockers are not as effective at preventing heart failure and hypertension. And then for the lisinopril group, again, no outcomes were better with the lisinopril than with the chlorthalidone, but stroke, combined cardiovascular disease, and heart failure were better with the chlorthalidone. And so this heart failure was a consistent finding with all three of the classes where the diuretic was better. Now, with the I'm not going to show you all the subgroups, but as you may be aware, there were no subgroup differences, no heterogeneity based on having diabetes or prior cardiovascular disease, age, men or women, CKD. All the subgroups showed similar effects of what I've already just shown you, except for lisinopril chlorthalidone comparison in Black patients. And so here what we saw with the lisinopril chlorthalidone comparison was that Black patients actually did a lot worse. And that has now been seen in other studies and is reflected in all the newer guidelines, which my colleagues may mention. For the non-Black patients, the differences were less so, and only heart failure was significantly worse with the lisinopril. And I don't have time to go into it, but it really was predominantly preserved EF heart failure that the diuretic was superior to the ACE inhibitor, and they were actually similar for preventing low EF heart failure. So this shows, of those who were withdrawn from the drugs, what were the causes of that? And about 3 to 5% of all participants over 5 years were withdrawn because of adverse effects. And what I wanted to highlight is that the diuretic actually had the least percent of patients that were withdrawn because of adverse effects. A little bit more for biochemical effects, but still very low rates of being withdrawn for things like hyponatremia or hypokalemia. And so this then was reflected in the year after the ALLHAT results were published. The U.S. Joint National Committee report number 7 in 2003 then recommended, and this is the algorithm, and when it comes to patients without a compelling indication for one of the other agents, then for both stage 1 and stage 2, thiazide type diuretics were preferred as initial therapy, either alone initially or in combination. And we recommended in the patients with stage 2 hypertension to start with 2 drugs, as has already been alluded to, and that one of those drugs should usually be a thiazide type diuretic. And so the antihypertensive trial in ALLHAT has implications. At that time, thiazide type diuretics were recommended to be the drug of choice for initial therapy of hypertension in the US, both for the JNC7 and also for the US VA Department of Defense guidelines, unless there was a compelling indication for another class, which certainly could be the case. For the patient who couldn't take a diuretic, which we said should be an unusual circumstance, calcium blockers, ACE inhibitors, or then later ARBs could be considered. And in Black hypertensive patients whose major risk is for a cardiovascular event, thiazide type diuretics or calcium blockers in those who couldn't take a thiazide diuretic were recommended over RAS blockers, and that has been reflected in subsequent guidelines as well. And then most hypertensive patients we thought could require more than one drug. Diuretics should generally be part of the antihypertensive regimen, and almost all combination regimens are more effective when a diuretic is included as well. So I'm going to stop with that brief review, and I thank you for your attention.
I think Jagdish, it can roll on to Dr. Jackson Wright, right? Jagdish? Yes. Jackson?
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Sterling. Thank you, Dr. Ram, Professor Ram. It's hard for me to believe it's been 20 years since the publication of the ALLHAT results. Though, as mentioned by Bill, we're actually talking about over 30 years for Paul, Bill, and I. When you include the the planning, the pilot phase, not to mention the grant application portion of the beginning of ALLHAT. I guess time does fly whether you're having fun or not. But I certainly want to thank the organizers of this symposium for extending me the opportunity to address this forum today. To summarize Bill's presentation shown here, the clinical outcomes from in ALLHAT revealed one that the doxazine arm was discontinued prematurely by the independent at the recommendation of the independent monitoring board because of a unfavorable effect of the doxazine compared to chlorthalidone on combined cardiovascular events, heart failure, and stroke. The trial was powered for coronary events, but did not show with any of the agents any beneficial effect of the newer agents compared to chlorthalidone. And impressively, none of the outcomes was in fact the newer agents found to be more effective than chlorthalidone in preventing the complications of hypertension. Of interest, certainly, was the comparison of the drugs on heart failure with regards to the ACE inhibitors, and also with regards to end-stage renal disease. Again, the ACE inhibitors were not shown to be more effective in preventing these outcomes compared to the chlorthalidone. Subsequent to ALLHAT, we have the SPRINT trial, and in SPRINT, the chlorthalidone was the drug was the recommended diuretic to be used in SPRINT. Well over half of the participants in SPRINT received the diuretic, and nearly 90% of the thiazide type diuretic used in SPRINT was chlorthalidone. And as you can see from the results, that there was a dramatic reduction. With SPRINT, the objective was to assess the two blood pressure targets, less than 120 systolic versus less than 140 systolic. And it showed a 27% reduction in the primary outcome, which consisted of MI, acute coronary syndrome, stroke, heart failure, and cardiovascular death. And showed a 27% reduction in the primary outcome, and significant reductions in myocardial infarction, clearly dramatic reductions in heart failure, and cardiovascular death from cardiovascular causes was also substantially reduced in those treated to the lower blood pressure target in the SPRINT trial. What I've shown you here is the subgroup breakdown of the SPRINT trial by outcome. For the primary outcome, as you can see, there was essentially, whether you're talking about broken down, there were pre-specified outcomes: age, gender, Black versus non-Black race, prior versus no prior CKD, prior versus no prior cardiovascular events, and blood pressure, baseline blood pressure tertiles. And as you can see, there was no significant difference in the outcomes in any of these pre-specified subgroups. And also there was similar results in those patients, whether do not have significant numbers of Indian patients within the trial or Asian patients, but certainly Hispanic patients were seen, and were also did not see any differential effect on the trial results in Hispanics, non-Hispanic Black, non-Hispanic whites, by frailty status. Certainly did not have diabetics in the trial, but did have patients with metabolic syndrome. Again, similar benefit of the lower blood pressure target with chlorthalidone as a major component. And in patients with prediabetes, again, similar effect of the lower blood pressure target in patients with prediabetes. Importantly is the fact that the blood pressure, the intensive target systolic blood pressure is less than 120. This is the first time that any blood pressure target that low had been attempted in a clinical outcome trial. And clearly we were successful in achieving that. If you look at the average follow-up blood pressures in the trial, in all of the pre-specified subgroups, we were if you look at the average systolic blood pressure was very similar, regardless of either the pre-specified or the not pre-specified subgroups. And if you look at this, it includes during the titration phase of titrating the medications to achieve these blood pressure targets. But if you look at after the 6 months of titration phase, certainly we were consistently able to achieve the systolic blood pressure less than 120 in nearly all of the pre-specified and non-pre-specified subgroups. So that one, chlorthalidone was shown to be effective compared to other agents, and two, was very effective in achieving blood pressure targets that have also been shown to be very effective in reducing clinical outcomes. As a result, we're beginning to see and have begun to see national and international guidelines begin to evaluate the choice of thiazide and thiazide type diuretics in controlling in their recommendations for controlling patients with hypertension. The UK NICE guidelines states in their guideline in 2019 that is starting or changing diuretic treatment for hypertension, offer a thiazide-like diuretic such as indapamide or chlorthalidone in preference to conventional thiazide diuretics such as benzoflumethiazide or hydrochlorothiazide. The Canadian guideline indicates that a grade A recommendation for monotherapy choices of a thiazide-like diuretic, with a grade B recommendation for the longer acting diuretics are preferred. And certainly the 2017 US guideline clearly states that chlorthalidone is preferred on the basis of prolonged half-life and proven trial reduction of cardiovascular events. Now, a note here, the current Indian guidelines as of 2019, and there is no mention of drug preference, but only that there is a recommendation that the dose of a thiazide diuretic being used should be less than 25 milligrams per day, equivalent to hydrochlorothiazide. There is in India, unlike the US, there is both a 6.25 and a 12.5 milligram dose of chlorthalidone available, which is not available in the US. So I make mention of that. But but we'll say that, and we'll show later that doses that low have not been seen, have not been tested in a clinical outcome trial. Unfortunately, the use of the thiazide type diuretics, and in fact, particularly the recommended doses that have been seen in clinical outcome trials are not as well utilized in practice. These are data from a publicly patients receiving public insurance for healthcare throughout the state of Ohio in the U.S., showing that chlorthalidone usage is certainly approximates the use of clonidine, essentially. So it's not that well used. And these data, we see this in this. These are patients who with uncontrolled hypertension, and so these are patients who are not controlled, and despite that, they're still on relatively low doses or not being treated with chlorthalidone. And certainly the lowest doses of hydrochlorothiazide, 12.5, 25, very little use of the higher doses of 50 milligrams of hydrochlorothiazide. So that despite the blood pressure not being controlled, they're still not being used. Certainly have room to use certainly chlorthalidone and certainly higher doses of even hydrochlorothiazide. And this is important because of the fact that these are of all of the clinical outcome trials for hypertension, going back to the VA cooperative trials, hydrochlorothiazide was in fact used at doses of 100 milligrams. Notice the HDFP chlorthalidone was used at between up to 100 milligrams of chlorthalidone. But these are the results of the clinical trials that have used thiazide type diuretics, the doses used. And as you can see, they are much higher. You're talking about doses clearly above the 12.5, 25 of chlorthalidone, and certainly above 25 to 50 of hydrochlorothiazide. The only trial that has tested lower doses of hydrochlorothiazide was in the Accomplish trial, where 12.5, 25 of hydrochlorothiazide was used. And that is also the only trial where the diuretic arm of a trial was shown to be less effective than the non-diuretic arm of the trial. One question that has come up is whether or not chlorthalidone will reduce major cardiovascular events compared to hydrochlorothiazide. That's the discussion that's been going on, been multiple meta-analyses to try to answer that question. But Bill is the co-chair of a trial that will actually answer that question, the Diuretic Comparison Project, which is actually comparing hydrochlorothiazide 25 to 50 milligrams versus chlorthalidone 12.5 to 25 milligrams in 13,500 patients who are U.S. veterans. Primary outcome in that trial is stroke, myocardial infarction, hospitalized heart failure, urgent coronary revascularization, or non-cancer death. Estimated completion is sometime in 2023. And so we look forward to the results of that trial. In summary, ALLHAT clearly documented that thiazide type diuretics, chlorthalidone in particular, were unsurpassed in preventing cardiovascular and renal complications of hypertension. These results in those studies subsequent to ALLHAT have confirmed and increased the acceptance of thiazide and thiazide type diuretics in the management of hypertension today. In ALLHAT and subsequently in SPRINT, the thiazide type diuretics were shown to be effective in both the prevention of cardiovascular events, especially heart failure, and in reducing blood pressure, and that's regardless of age, race, frailty status, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, presence or absence of cardiovascular events, or CTD. Major cardiovascular national and international guidelines in the US, the UK, and Canada recognize the longer acting diuretics such as chlorthalidone as preferred. And despite ALLHAT and other trial data, chlorthalidone remains underutilized even in patients with uncontrolled hypertension. And a direct comparison, Bill is leading a direct comparison of chlorthalidone with hydrochlorothiazide on cardiovascular event outcomes currently in the US. And I'll thank you.
Thank you, Jackson. Jagdish, we can continue the theme because they have been introduced to Dr. Paul Whelton, who is going to then today and tomorrow, and he's going to give his remarks. Paul, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Venkata. Just slides. Okay, so thank you, Venkata. It's a wonderful privilege and pleasure to be with you and with all of our colleagues in India. Send you greetings and good evening from New Orleans. So I'm going to talk about our challenges going forward, and I have no conflicts of interest. So, let's start with the obvious. You know this as well as I know it. There is a huge burden of illness due to high blood pressure, and the epicenter of that is in Asia, and the two leading countries that have the biggest challenge or burden of illness are India and China. And most of that is manifested as ischemic coronary heart disease or stroke, either hemorrhagic or ischemic stroke, progressively moving towards ischemic stroke. And there's a continuous relationship between level of blood pressure and adverse outcomes. It goes all the way from really low levels of systolic, 90 millimeters or so, all the way up to the highest levels we can measure, over 180. And of course, we look at this and say, if we had a perfect cure, if we could just flip the switch, which we can't, we can improve, but we can't cure generally. At what level of blood pressure would we need to initiate drug treatment to be helpful? And we can generally estimate that if you're looking below the curve here, if you could successfully manage everybody that was above 150, that would really be helpful. Get you close to 40 to 45% of the blood pressure related events. If you went a little lower to initiate the treatment, 140 and above, you generally get at about 2/3 to maybe 70%. There'd still be a lot of blood pressure events that are occurring at lower levels of blood pressure. So job one for a country that hasn't really got all of those with the highest pressures controlled is to do that. But in countries like the US, where we've done a reasonable job at those higher pressures, we've started to move down to initiate or add drug therapy at slightly lower levels. Now, when we look worldwide, my colleagues and I at Tulane have done a number of estimates using the available population-based survey data where there is proper national or regional sampling. And I'm going to show you here are the data for 2010. We will update this, but it takes a while to get all the data in place to update it. And this is awareness, treatment, and control. And I've split it into high-income countries and low and middle-income countries. And either way, it's not good. High-income countries, even to control to less than 140/90, a substandard level now for any major guideline. No major guideline is saying you should be satisfied to only get below 140/90. But even at this rather low standard, less than 30% in high-income countries, and in middle and low-income countries, less than 8%, 1 in 13. Now, India would fit somewhere in the middle-income countries. And if we look at India, to the best of my knowledge, there's not a true national probability survey, but there are a number of regional surveys that are well done, and they've been pooled, and so we can get national estimates. And I'm going to focus over here on national estimates for control, and it's quite different in urban areas and in rural areas, but you know, whether you're looking at urban areas or rural areas, again, even to a rather low standard, less than 140/90, we can all look at this and say, we're not doing well. We need to do much better in the future. So that's the starting point. None of us are doing as well as we should be doing, and we have a lot of work to be done. Now, Dr. Wright and Dr. Cushman and I have been on many guidelines over the years, and Dr. Wright and I were on the ACCHA US guideline for 2017. Most recently, I participated in a guideline that was produced for the World Health Organization, and this was specifically targeted to middle and low income countries. I just want to show you here what we recommended based on a review of the available data for thresholds for initiating antihypertensive drug therapy. Now, this is in the context of individuals who are recommended already to get lifestyle modification. So we said it's a no-brainer that you would initiate drug therapy for anyone who has a correctly measured average systolic pressure of 140 or above, or diastolic of 90 and above, and that's a very strong recommendation. We went a step further and said for those in the 130 to 139 category of systolic blood pressure, if they have existing cardiovascular disease, again, there is strong evidence that you should be introducing drug therapy in addition to lifestyle modification. And we said, even in those 130 to 139 who haven't already had a cardiovascular event, but who are at high risk for cardiovascular disease or have diabetes or chronic kidney disease, we would also recommend introducing drug therapy. Conditional recommendation rather than a strong recommendation. And we recommended the same sorts of classes of therapy, of drug therapy that are recommended in all the other major guidelines. So 3 classes or 4 classes, depending on whether you're lumping ACEs and ARBs together or you're splitting them. But we recommended thiazide and thiazide-like agents. We recommended ACE or ARB, and we recommended long-acting dihydropyridine CCBs. And that was a strong recommendation, high certainty evidence. We suggested initial combination therapy using the agents from those 3 classes, preferably with a single pill combination, and that was a conditional recommendation. And we made remarks similar to what you'll find in some other guidelines, and that is that it becomes particularly important to have combination therapy if you're starting at a higher level of blood pressure. If somebody is more than 20 millimeters systolic above their goal or 10 millimeters diastolic above their goal, it makes great sense to start with combination therapy. And clearly, we recommended single pill combination therapy because it improves adherence and it gives better blood pressure control. But we noted, as was noted in the ACCHA guideline, that in many countries, single pill combinations are more expensive than giving those agents as individual components. And that's a challenge. It's particularly a challenge for people who have limited income. We also noted that in those combinations, many times the drugs that are used at doses that are unsatisfactory, particularly the diuretics. So that was a concern with single pill combinations. Now, obviously, there are many trials that have looked at single pill combinations versus placebo, many of them done in India. They're very, very good. I show here just an example from what I believe is the most recent trial. This is a trial in which a single pill combination included 4 antihypertensives at quarter doses compared to a single pill step care with starting with one drug. And what was seen in this trial is what's seen in almost all trials. Much quicker and better blood pressure control with the single pill combination, and that pattern was seen throughout the trial and was at 12 months quite substantial in giving a better blood pressure result, almost 8 millimeters systolic better for office blood pressure. So there's no question that these agents do give better blood pressure control, there's better adherence. I won't belabor ALLHAT again, but just to say what my colleagues have said, when you're thinking about these combinations, a diuretic, to my mind, is a must, unless there's some very unusual reason for not having it in, because nothing works better than a diuretic. We showed that in ALLHAT, and I would like to think that ALLHAT is the best design trial for looking at treatment that starts with these agents. And I should just say that as we added in second step therapy and third step therapy, we were careful in ALLHAT to have similar approaches in all the arms and to avoid using ACEs, ARBs, and the diuretics and vice versa. So it's rather convincing in the way it was done and in the results. And when we look at meta-analysis of all the trials that have compared different agents, we find a pretty similar result. This is one from our colleague in Greece, Dr. Thermopoulos. And here we're looking at the effect of diuretics here, ACE inhibitors here, beta blockers, ARBs, calcium channel blockers. And we're looking at, in each instance, the agent, diuretic here, versus all the other approaches, including placebo. And here are the outcomes. And when you look at this, yellow says they're about the same. Green says that agent that we're looking at is the best. And red says not as good. And when you look at this, there's only one class of drugs where you see green and yellow and no red, and that's diuretics. So I think it's very consistent whether you look at ALLHAT per se, which I think is the best comparison, or whether you throw in a lot of other trials that are not quite as good. I want to just look at two extremes of blood pressure. And if we go to the lower levels of blood pressure, low dose pharmacotherapy can be used for lowering blood pressure and preventing progression to hypertension. There have been 3 big trials, Trophy, Faro, and Preventive prevention. The most recent and best of these trials is the Preventive prevention trial. It's a very high quality trial. There was a multi-center trial done in Brazil. I was a part of it. And we compared low dose chlorthalidone, 12.5 milligrams per day, versus placebo in individuals who did not yet have high blood pressure. And we showed that you could lower blood pressure, you could reduce the likelihood for progressing to hypertension. But very importantly, we also looked at left ventricular mass. And however you looked at that, when you compared the chlorthalidone group to the placebo group, left ventricular mass was reduced and left ventricular hypertension was prevented in the chlorthalidone group. And obviously left ventricular hypertension is a very important intermediate indicator of disease occurring due to high blood pressure. So that's an important finding. If we look at the other extreme, we don't normally think of using a long-acting agent like chlorthalidone in advanced kidney disease. As a nephrologist, I'd counseled against that over the years. But there's a very interesting recent clinical trial in the New England Journal of Medicine. It's a high-quality trial, randomized, double-blinded, placebo-controlled, and it was done in advanced kidney failure, stage 4 chronic kidney disease. And this was done in a group of patients whose blood pressure was not adequately controlled. And you can see here, if you compare the blood pressure experience in the group that got placebo versus the group that got chlorthalidone, there's a very big difference. At the end of the trial here, over 12 millimeters of mercury systolic difference for office blood pressure, and 10.5 millimeters of mercury for ambulatory blood pressure. Those are big differences and are very likely to result in important cardiovascular benefits in a group at very high risk. So whether you're looking at lower blood pressure or you're looking at very high pressure, the long-acting agents like chlorthalidone seem to be very important to include in combinations. And I would say going forward, we have a lot to do. We know what to do, we just need to do it. And the problem is we're not doing it as well. And whether it is in the US or it's in India or it's in Uganda or it's in China, the way to be successful is really the same. First, there has to be a commitment to be successful, whether it's at the individual level, the institutional level, the country level. Using simple evidence-based protocols. Don't complicate the process. We tend to complicate the process. Simple approaches work and work very well. For sure, health promotion, lifestyle modification is very, very important. Community-based patient-centered care, preferably team-based care, because every meta-analysis we do indicates that when it's possible to do team-based care, the results are far superior than the traditional clinician alone care. A very important one is reliable access to affordable medication. And it's a stumbling block in many countries. And there are many efforts underway now to try to deal with that. I'm involved as others on this call are in some of those initiatives. And the last, but certainly not the least, is tracking. Information systems can be simple, can be more complicated, but who's controlled in their blood pressure, who's showing up for visits, who's filling their prescriptions, taking their meds. This sort of approach, when it's applied and applied well, gets you very, very high control rates. So we know what to do and we need to do it. And I want to say thank you very, very much for inviting me to be a part of this panel.
I think Dr. Venkatram, for you to take over, and we would like to listen from you. The ALLHAT relevance, is it today, tomorrow, or always?
Okay. Thank you, JS. It will be very brief, and after my discussion, kindly moderate the session. And there are lot of questions coming up on the chat. Ladies and gentlemen, all of you have heard really a kind of a nice approach, that a kaleidoscopic view of the birth of ALLHAT, the various publications, more than 100 publications or so, and the guidelines that you have seen. So my brief responsibility is, of course, non-pharmacological treatment is a foundation for prevention of cardiovascular disease. But in terms of pharmacological treatment, so many choices, and what the guidelines have recommended, how to apply them to the ultimate advantage of the patient. So that is what I'm going to discuss with some relevance to the diuretics. there are a number of trials that have happened. These are diuretic-based trials during our lifetime, which have shown that diuretic-based therapy could have positive outcomes and started in hypertension detection follow-up program, multiple risk factor intervention trials, systolic hypertension in the elderly program, treatment of mild hypertension, ALLHAT, SHEP extension, SPRINT, etc. So these are landmark trials in the pharmacological treatment of hypertension. Of course, we should also remember other trials which are not on this slide, like HOT, Value, ASCOT, Life, ACCORD, etc. All of these trials with different outcomes have shown the proper management of hypertension and how to further reduce the cardiovascular disease in the community. Now, there is some controversy about, not controversy, but the American Heart Association, American College of Cardiology have not listed beta blockers in the initial therapy of hypertension as monotherapy, whereas European Society of Hypertension, European Society of Cardiology have. But one thing that has always been a common denominator for various recommendations have been diuretics. Just a historical note of JNC1. I was a young resident at that time, and JNC1 was chaired by a person of Indian origin, Dr. Iqbal Kishan, who was at the Mayo Clinic at that time. And they were the first guidelines that they have recommended. And the same diuretics were recommended in JNC 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and the last guidelines, which is equivalent to JNC 8, American College of Cardiology, American Heart Association. All of these trials have the common denominator that diuretics can be considered as initial therapy for hypertension. Now, this is the reason I'm showing these slides is some of the meetings that we have in India. People generally ask if there are direct head-to-head comparison between different diuretics. Not really. Now it's ongoing, but usually you look at the different trials and to see if you can match them to some extent. And this is a meta-analysis looking at the risk of cardiovascular events if you give a hydrochlorothiazide in optimal dosage or chlorthalidone. And this meta-analysis suggests that at the same level of blood pressure, there appears to be a benefit towards thiazide-like diuretics such as chlorthalidone, probably because of its long duration of action. When you look at, there are several meta-analyses. This is one meta-analysis looking at the comparison between chlorthalidone and hydrochlorothiazide in terms of the outcome. There is a little bit favor towards chlorthalidone, again, probably due to the duration of action and continued blood pressure reduction, where the blood pressure may not fluctuate that much. In fact, studies have shown that you have a continuous blood pressure control. Dr. Whelton has actually shown this slide in a tabular form, where he and his colleagues in Brazil have shown that chlorthalidone-based therapy in comparison to placebo has been shown to cause reversal or regression of left ventricular hypertrophy, which is an important index of blood pressure control. And Dr. Whelton has already shown that the new onset of hypertension was significantly attenuated in the patients who were exposed to chlorthalidone compared to placebo. And this prevention of hypertension is somewhat comparable to TROPHY trial, which also was shown by Dr. Whelton. So it looks like at least two agents have been shown to prevent new onset of hypertension, almost like a prophylactic pharmacological therapy to prevent hypertension. Few things, some of World Hypertension League, International Society of Hypertension, with which we have worked, and people have come and worked in India. This is the past president of World Hypertension League, he, at that time, based upon the evidence, he suggested that chlorthalidone low dose is a good option for countries like India, and because the aim of World Hypertension League is to control the blood pressure globally. Late Dr. Thomas Giles, who was also in India several times, and he also looked at the dosages and the response to treatment. And before he passed away, he did say that probably a low dose therapy in combination could be important for blood pressure control in India. The last president of the American Society of Hypertension, before it merged with the American Heart Association, Dr. Joseph Bisignano also looked at all the data that were published from India on cardiovascular deaths, suggested that low-dose chlorthalidone therapy has the potential of improving the patient compliance with good blood pressure control. And I have summarized all these things. All these trials were discussed earlier on. Dr. Franz Messerli, who is once upon a time who was a critic of meta-analysis, now he's a meta-analysis expert, has also suggested that countries like India, with large populations, as Dr. Whelton has pointed out, of uncontrolled hypertension, could benefit from proper application of pharmacological advances and clinical outcome trials. So, ladies and gentlemen, in the brief time that I had, the question that has been asked to me before about the comparison between different diuretics based upon the scientific evidence, I have shown to some extent. And there is one small point, a personal point that I want to make. In late 70s and early 80s, my former partner, late Dr. Norman Kaplan, introduced me to a researcher at University of California, Los Angeles, late Dr. Mohinder Sambi, SAMBHI. He was a very good researcher of Indian origin. And I was young at that time. He put his hand on my shoulder and gave me a book. He said, Venkata, you go back and read this book. And I looked at the book, and the book was called Chlorthalidone. He edited a book, and which had got a lot of trials published at that time, a very remarkable individual. His main interest was renin-angiotensin system, but he spent a lot of time looking at the pharmacological management of hypertension. And in his honor, there is a chair of preventive medicine and hypertension in Ludhiana. So there are some historical connections between the pharmacological advances and the current treatment of hypertension in people of Indian origin, including, of course, the discovery of reserpine in India by Dr. Rusum Jal Vakil. Because the reason I mention is today's meeting is very, very historical. It is very unusual for most of us to discuss trials that have been 20 years, 25 years, 30 years. Most of the trials are very short-term trials. So I hope that in the time that was given to me, I gave a quick comparison and compared them to guidelines. So with those remarks, JS, I will conclude, and I will ask you to completely take over the session and continue with the panelist remarks. And then looks like there are some questions on chat box. So Jagdish, it's yours.
Thank you, Dr. Ram. Well, we've had real good discussions by the stalwarts related to what blood pressure is going to be and what we can do about it. The conclusions that I drew is that ALLHAT was a all-time great trial. It was a landmark trial which changed the prescription patterns of the world. We can say the sequence could be DAC for India, that is diuretic, especially chlorthalidone to start with, then A, probably ARB because of the higher incidence of cough with ACE inhibitors in India. And then based on the blood pressure, we can add a CCB. So that sequence, if you use, most of them could be controlled at least below 140/90. And then our next best aim would be to bring them down below 135. Reserve the alpha blocker and the beta blocker for special situation, beta blockers for the compelling indications and alpha blocker for uncontrolled hypertension. Chlorthalidone was used in 90% of all the ALLHAT patients. So it's a significant statement to make, to remember, and to implement in our practice. As it is said, the minimum that you can do is bring most of the patients below 140/90, and optimal is to bring them below maybe 130 systolic. Fixed dose combination, fortunately, are aplenty in India, and we can start to them from the beginning, and it should have chlorthalidone as a combination treatment in the first 2 drugs, and the 3rd drug will come in when required. So I think this summarizes most of the things that we were said in the last 4 talks. And then I now invite Dr. Mohan for his comments. Dr. Mohan, please. You can unmute yourself, please.
Thank you, Dr. Hiramath, and thank you, Dr. Venkatram. Over the last hour or so, I've been enjoying 3 presentations from the doyens, and hearing it straight from the doyens themselves is a great honor. And I've learned a lot, although the trial is old, but all the new perspectives and the developments thereafter. So Dr. Venkatram actually asked me to come in to talk about the diabetes perspective, because there's often a notion that diuretic should not be used by people with diabetes, and can chlorthalidone be used? And what did the ALLHAT study show as far as the diabetogenic effect of chlorthalidone? Well, here are the facts, and let me put down 2 or 3 facts. I thought some of you may be actually presenting that, so I didn't get the slides ready, but the results were that when compared to amlodipine and lisinopril, there was a 2.8 milligram reduction increase in the fasting glucose. So it's just 2 milligram, less than 3 milligram increase in the fasting glucose. Now, when you look at the baseline and look at 4 years later, and the change among the people without diabetes, the non-diabetic people who had fasting glucose less than 126, interestingly enough, there was 11 milligram increase in all the 3 groups. So this does not seem to be specific for chlorthalidone. I wonder whether it's because all the participants were 4 years older, and therefore their fasting glucoses went up. They could have moved to the pre-diabetic range because of age. That's just a hypothesis. Now, if you look at the incidence of diabetes, how many people developed a fasting glucose above 126, it was slightly higher in the chlorthalidone group, 11.6%, compared to 9.8 with the amlodipine group and 8.1 in the lisinopril group. So all 3 groups moved up. So again, probably a function of age. 4 years at that age makes a lot of difference in the prevalence of diabetes and prediabetes, and therefore, but still there was a slight increase in the chlorthalidone group. But having said that, if you look at all the results which were presented by the 3 speakers, the fabulous results that were obtained, particularly with respect to cardiovascular disease, as well as heart failure. I mean, heart failure, chlorthalidone right out at the right end of the graph, completely away from the other 2 groups. You compare the amlodipine or with the lisinopril, was very, very impressive. And therefore, in the context of diabetes, where heart failure is so common, and we are now very excited by the newer drugs like the SGLT2 groups, which we are using now, we already have an old drug which has been proven. And that's what actually struck my eyes when I saw that. Here is a drug which we should be all using. The mention was made that chlorthalidone is underutilized, and the percentage of 9% was shown. I wonder why, because I think we should be using more of this drug. It's less expensive. It's affordable in a country like India, where it's very, very important to use that, and we are not achieving the targets. Dr. Cushman said that diuretics have very little side effects, and that's another indication that people say, oh, it can affect your potassium, to affect this, but it didn't do that. In the ALLHAT study, there was no change in potassium at all with the chlorthalidone. So the side effects part, we are not worried about. Dr. Jackson Wright mentioned that it can be used in people with diabetes, and I entirely agree. It should be used, if at all, it should be used more in people with diabetes. Dr. Whelton mentioned that there's very little data from India. That's true, but the ICMR INDIAB study, which is primarily a diabetes study, but it's actually looking at hypertension and dyslipidemia in the whole country. This is actually one of the largest epidemiological studies done, 120,000 individuals, representative of India's 1.3 1.36 billion, studied in every state of the country. The first 15 states was published in Journal of Human Hypertension, 2015 March issue, and we've just completed the whole study. So the entire 30 state data will be presented, where we have the rule of halves nicely coming out, which you also showed, how many know that they have it, how many then take treatment, how many are controlled. Miserable. So if you look at the whole country, very, very depressing. That still more than 50–60% do not even know that they have hypertension. Less than half of those take treatment, and less than half of those are under control. So long way to go. We have a paper coming out perhaps in a week or two in Lancet Diabetes Endocrinology. This is again from the ISMER INDIAB study, but this is on the total number of diabetic people in the whole survey. The self-reported diabetes, and there we are looking at the ABC. How many achieved an A1C less than 7%? How many achieved a blood pressure? We took it very conservatively. I know you said it's substandard control, but we just took 140/90 and said how many achieved that, and an LDL cholesterol of less than 100. So the ABC study, we call it. This is for the whole country now, and this will be out. I think it's in press now. It should be out in the next 2 weeks or so. So look for that. So that has data on, or at least in the diabetic population. But we also have on the whole country in the non-diabetic population. Well, we have surveyed the whole country. So very soon the 30 state, that's the whole country data, will be published on hypertension control as well. So these are the points that I wanted to say, that I think chlorthalidone is a very good drug. It should be used. And now we have more recent drugs coming in. But with that, I think old is still gold. And at least in with people with diabetes, we should not hesitate to use it. And the underutilization of this drug should be corrected, particularly for controlling systolic hypertension. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Mohan, for that erudite and insightful presentation of yours. It gives us good idea. When you say that it could be used in diabetes, we feel confident, and we shall do that. I invite Dr. Abhijit Tarafdar to give his comments from the nephrology perspective. Dr. Abhijit.
Good evening. It's a wonderful evening. First of all, let me thank the 2 chairpersons and the 3 speakers. Am I audible? Is it
yes.
Okay? Okay. Like in any war, in any trial also, there are casualties and gains. In ALLHAT also, the casualty was alpha blocker, and the gain was, of course, the diuretics. The casualty, that means alpha blockers, doxorubicin, was primarily because of heart failure. And we know that from nephrologist's perspective, alpha blockers are not bad drugs, particularly in the elderly who have enlarged prostate. As add-on therapy, we do try alpha blockers, and we have found, particularly in those patients who have a night rise blood pressure, if we give alpha blockers at night, they go a long way to control blood pressure at night. So this is about the casualty. Then let us come to the gain. The gain is, of course, diuretics, and of course, of the diuretics, it's chlorthalidone. Gain, you easily imagine, if you go by trial after trial, recommendation after recommendation, guideline after guideline, in each diuretics have been given due credence as the first-line therapy. But once again, the question once again is raised time and again, in spite of all these recommendations, chlorthalidone never gained that credence, that much of sincere approach and recommendation from physicians, nephrologists, and everyone. To me, there are, in addition to the so-called complications of dyselectrolytemia and so-called sexual dysfunction in some of the male patients, I think one of the great demerit of chlorthalidone is it's very inexpensive. Had it been a very expensive medicine, the pharmaceutical industry would have taken much of interest in favor of chlorthalidone. And that is its demerit. Because it is inexpensive, chlorthalidone didn't get that much of highlight that it should have. Coming to the nephrologist perspective, as Dr. Whelton was describing, from nephrologist perspective, I must say that when we attend patients, any patient of chronic kidney disease is referred to a nephrologist, not in CKD 1, not in CKD 2, 3, but in CKD 4 when the GFR is already less than 30. And then we have very limited scope, limited armamentarium, therapeutic armamentarium. Coming to diuretics, then the diuretics that are left as of now was high ceiling diuretics like furosemide or torsemide. Now, after that, the trial has been highlighted by Dr. Whelton, that the trial that was published recently in New England Journal of Medicine, the CLIC trial, which has shown that chlorthalidone can be used at a GFR of less than 30 up to a GFR of 23. If that be so, then there is an opening of gamut of the scope of prescribing chlorthalidone, because now we can prescribe chlorthalidone, because it was initially thought that it could be prescribed up to a GFR of 30. Now we can prescribe it up to a GFR of 23. So up to a GFR 23, we can prescribe chlorthalidone, and chlorthalidone not only is a good antihypertensive, in that trial it has been shown that chlorthalidone reduces proteinuria up to the extent of 50%. And proteinuria is a surrogate marker both of kidney as well as heart protection. So to me, chlorthalidone is a good drug, not only because it's a good antihypertensive, but it also reduces proteinuria, maybe A, because of control of blood pressure, B, because of hemodynamic effect, reducing intraglomerular pressure, and C, because it stimulates the renin-angiotensin system, so that the combination therapy with RAS blockers, which has been tried in CLIC, can be of more effect. And lastly, the advantage of all these diuretics and combination is, we nephrologists have hypertension which have some special features. One special feature is these patients tend to have a night rise of blood pressure. So if you look at the new trial, the CLIC trial, you'll find that chlorthalidone controls this night rise of blood pressure as well. So these night risers are being addressed adequately by combining with chlorthalidone. This is one. This is very important, because otherwise we have to either split or give some medicine with a longer action. And we know that chlorthalidone is a longer acting antihypertensive. So it takes care of the night rise of blood pressure. That is one. And the second thing that is also a very important thing is, in this CLIC trial also, the entire group had theoretically had resistant hypertension, because most of the patients required an antihypertensive of 3.4 antihypertensive drugs. So by definition, 3 or more, that means it's resistant hypertension. So here we find one drug, one new agent, or rather old agent in a new area, which can be used in the area of resistant hypertension, which is so very common in nephrology perspective. So firstly, it's a very interesting drug in the sense it's cheap. Second, it takes care of nighttime blood pressure rise also. C, it reduces intraglomerular pressure maybe, and that is the reason, or through the RAS blocker activation, it reduces proteinuria, and that is translated into renal protection and maybe cardiovascular protection also. And lastly, in resistant hypertension, it can be given in a cheap way. So taking into consideration all these, chlorthalidone, a forgotten drug, a cheap drug, should have gained some new access in the therapeutic armamentarium of antihypertensive therapy.
Thank you, Dr. Tarafdar, for bringing up the importance of chlorthalidone, the underscoring the underutilization that all of us are probably doing related to that, and also creating a war zone here in this webinar too. We have some questions in the chat box, and we have about 13-14 minutes before I hand over this session finally to Dr. Venkatram. So I'll go sequentially without, can I request Dr. Wright to answer the first question which is, it says, accomplished trial showed that the combination of CCB and ARB was better than ACE plus diuretic. Does it mean that diuretic should be the third choice?
I'm sorry, was that directed to me?
Yes, right, sir.
Oh, okay, sure. Both Dr. Cushman and I were actually investigators in the accomplished trial. The answer is it was not a great comparison. One, as I indicated in my presentation, the dosage of thiazide type diuretic used was hydrochlorothiazide at 12.5 and 25 milligrams. Added to, it was an ACE inhibitor, benazepril was the ACE inhibitor that was used, compared to amlodipine, 5 and 10 milligrams, in addition to the, again, ACE inhibitor, benazepril. So the only difference between the two arms was we were essentially comparing the 12.5 and 25 of hydrochlorothiazide versus 5 and 10 of amlodipine. Now, if you look at what we've been discussing with regards to looking at hydrochlorothiazide versus chlorthalidone, which was the head-to-head comparison within the ALLHAT trial, there you were essentially using equivalent doses of the diuretic with the dose of the calcium channel blocker. So that I think Bill and I had a discussion even before the trial began, indicating that to some extent, the trial was somewhat biased against the diuretic. Again, we have the head-to-head comparison between chlorthalidone versus the calcium channel blocker. At equivalent doses, equivalent blood pressure lowering was seen. Accomplished was a much lower dose of the diuretic arm. And so that, and as I again indicated, the 12.5 and 25 was the only diuretic arm of any trial where the diuretic arm was not, in fact, was found to be inferior.
Thank you. It means the diuretic need not be the third drug. It could very well be the first drug.
Again,
so
yes.
Whelton, if you could take the next question, would you be shy of prescribing a chlorthalidone at night because of increased frequency of urination, especially when you want to step up? Would you be giving it at night, or would you be giving the double dose in the morning?
I would say whenever it's easiest for somebody to remember to take their medication is the right time to give it to them. I take chlorthalidone myself. I take chlorthalidone lisinopril. I aim to have my systolic less than 120, and I have it less than 120 very easily. Most people, like me, I have it at the bedside in a little pill container, and it's very easy for me in the morning when I get up to take my medicines. So chlorthalidone obviously is long acting, and you can take, obviously it's once a day, so it's convenient for me to take it in the morning, but it doesn't really matter. There's no evidence that taking pills at nighttime is superior than taking long-acting pills in the morning. And I would just make one quick other remark, well, two quick other remarks. First and foremost, of course, getting blood pressure down is the most important goal. We do think that there's reason to believe that long-acting agents like chlorthalidone should be a part of combinations. Also just make the observation that when I was starting my career, we used combination therapy. All the early trials, like the Veterans trials, were based on combination therapy. And any of you who are as old as I am will probably remember, at least in the US, we had what was called Serapis. It had 3 active agents in it, and that's what we used to manage people. And then we went into the phase later on, based on clinical trials, of going to step care therapy with starting with one drug, adding another drug. It seems very logical. And now we're back to combination therapy because in practical terms, it just seems to work better if the price is right.
Okay, thank you. It means if it comes to that, the diuretic could be prescribed at night is what I derive from that. Of course, compliance of the medication and lowering of blood pressure is the paramount, and probably after a few weeks, the chlorthalidone starts working as a vasodilator, if I understand it correctly. So not so much of a problem related to frequency of medication. May I request Dr. Cushman to answer the next question? How much is the incidence of postural hypotension in elderly above 70 years of age with the diuretic therapy? And the second is, which one should be preferred, monotherapy or low dose multiple drug therapy, which was partly answered, but we want to have your views. First question is related to the postural hypotension.
Yeah, so as we've talked about in the SPRINT trial, we actually were titrating down to less than 120 systolic, and it turned out that orthostatic hypotension was, and the diuretic chlorthalidone was primarily the mainstay of therapy, as was mentioned, and orthostatic hypotension was less common in those who were at the 140 goal as opposed to the 120 goal. And so we didn't measure orthostatic hypotension carefully in the ALLHAT study, but by and large, diuretics for most patients are not do not cause them to be prone to orthostatic hypotension. Now, there are exceptions to that, and the exception is if they get really dehydrated, which is rare from the therapy itself, but maybe from something else going on, if they get sick or they're just not eating and drinking properly, that kind of thing. So the drugs that are more prone to orthostatic hypotension are drugs like clonidine and alpha blockers like doxazosin. And so, you do have to be cautious about that. And of course, there are some patients that are just, that have autonomic dysfunction and are just prone to it. And you just have to do all kinds of things to play with the medications. Now, so in ALLHAT, the adverse effects, overall, the older patients above 75 had more reported adverse effects in general, but the 120 group was still did just as well or better than the 140 goal group. Now, for the combinations, that's actually a very hot subject that's under study right now. I think it's important to point out that if you use low dose combinations, you do in general get better blood pressure control than a single drug. And that data, some of that data, Dr. Whelton showed earlier. The problem we have with that is that there may be dose-dependent effects on cardiovascular outcomes that Dr. Wright referred to, for example, in the ACCOMPLISH trial, where using a lower dose may lower blood pressure, okay, but you may not get the same benefits as you get from the doses that were used in the clinical trials. And so I think that we have this paradox where we've used, for example, with chlorthalidone, 12.5 to 25 milligrams in outcome trials, or even for hydrochlorothiazide, 25 to 50 is the lowest dose that's been shown to really be effective. So we have those doses. And then with RAS blockers, we know for heart failure and renal outcomes that the full doses are more effective than lower doses. So I think we have to keep that in mind, even though for patients that may not tolerate the full doses, then we can try the lower doses. I do think, and others may want to comment on this, but I think for initiation of therapy in many hypertensive patients, it's probably not a bad idea to give a combination with lower doses than what we perhaps achieved in trials, and then be willing to titrate up. And so you may give a half dose, of a combination, and then if the blood pressure is not controlled, to go to the fuller dose, if you will.
Bill, you're obviously have a lot of experience with hypertension. And I wanted to draw you out a little bit. So hypertension is basically a blood pressure measurement. It's not a physiological concern per se. And it's only important really if it goes on to syncope and maybe some of the complications. So could you expound a little bit on hypertension and what might be the consequences and whether those are common or real in clinical trials and clinical practice?
Yeah, hypotension is what you said, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So we don't know that. I mean, clearly, when some patients are getting sicker and very elderly, their blood pressures may go lower, and those then they can be associated with higher risk and higher mortality in those with very low blood pressures. As you know, in studies like the SPRINT trial, when we were titrating to a systolic less than 120, we did see a lot of patients that systolics of 100, even 90. I think our experience was that most investigators, even the patients were asymptomatic, which most of them were at those levels. If the blood pressure was below 90, for example, most of us would have backed off of therapy some. But there were a lot of patients that had systolics of 100, 110 who did quite well. And overall, in the SPRINT trial, there was no evidence of an increase in cardiovascular events or mortality with lower blood pressures. And I don't know if that answers your question or if you wanted to expound on that.
Yeah, well, I would just sort of expounding by saying, in general, hypertension only becomes important if it leads to something like syncope and somebody has a fall and they have a complication like a fracture or hypoperfusion of an important organ like the brain or the heart. And so when we report hypertension in clinical trials, it's based on a blood pressure measurement.
Right.
And we have to distinguish between a blood pressure measurement and what's really physiologically important to a patient.
And certainly if the patient has symptomatic orthostatic hypotension, which we did have to deal with, of course, in the clinical trials, as well as in our clinics, then we make adjustments. And one thing that we saw in the SPRINT trial is that we could often change the kinds of medicines patients were on without really sacrificing the 120 goal. And so it's not always allowing the blood pressure to be higher, but it may be just changing the medications and getting them off of drugs like alpha blockers or clonidine.
Yes, I was coming to your comment, Dr. Wright. So please go ahead with a comment because I see your comment in the chat box.
Yeah. I was going to say, with regards to orthostatic hypotension, we did see, in fact, less orthostatic hypotension in patients who had whose blood pressure was controlled compared to, and we also in the less orthostatic hypotension in the patients in the intensive arm than in the standard arm one, and and this has been seen in other trials. Also, I believe at least even a recent meta-analysis showed that patients whose blood pressure was in fact with controlled blood pressure, the lower the blood pressure, the less was the incidence of orthostatic hypotension. We've also looked at the concern with regards to the J-curve within the SPRINT trial. And what we saw was that patients with lower diastolic blood pressures had certainly were at higher risk for cardiovascular complications. But in fact, even in those patients at equivalent diastolic blood pressures, those in the intensive arm still had lower rates of events than did those in the standard arm. So again, a good blood pressure control, aggressive blood pressure control does produce less orthostatic hypotension as well as less in the way of cardiovascular events.
Thank you. I think the chat box is full, as I see. but I hand over to Dr. Venkatram for we are already about 1 minute behind schedule. So you could start answering, or you can start your concluding remarks with answering the question from a chat box as to your drug of choice for isolated systolic hypertension, and then you can continue on to your concluding remarks. Dr. Venkatram.
Thank you, JS. I'm also looking at the chat box. We'll try to respond to them very, very quickly, very, very fast. If our panelists or the other faculty differ, please raise your hand and then I will not continue. The combination of chlorthalidone and a loop diuretic, I would not recommend it because you are completely paralyzing the loop, and so you cannot reabsorb anything. And studies have shown it certainly decreases weight, decreases edema, but not to be given intentionally, the combination of a loop diuretic or any thiazide diuretic, etc. Now, the incidence of hyponatremia with chlorthalidone, according to the according to Mr. Fitt's study, is very similar to that of hydrochlorothiazide. 7-year follow-up, very, very similar, nothing more in that particular study. What is the optimal dosage of the diuretic in the Indian population? You have all heard about the low dosage, because low dosage doesn't mean it is ineffective. Low dose is 6.25, 12.5 of chlorthalidone, and 12.5 to 25. That probably beyond that, you don't get much benefit, especially in terms of combination. Hyponatremia does occur, of course, with diuretics, especially in hot and humid climates, especially in the elderly. Hyponatremia can happen because Dr. Abhijit Tarabdar is there. He knows that in the elderly people, when they get volume depleted, there is a stimulation of antidiuretic hormone. ADH stimulation is very, very brisk in the elderly, and they can develop hyponatremia. So you have to be careful. Hot and humid and elderly patients, you have to be very careful. ARB doses that achieve the blood pressure goal, should we give higher dose than blood pressure goal for cardiovascular benefits? I don't think so. Whatever the doses that have been used in clinical trials, one should try to utilize them on all the ARB trials, especially in hypertension or blood pressure goal. And I don't think increasing the dosage would give additional benefit. I really doubt it. There are no clinical trials. So I think JS, few things. Abhijit has a comment. Yes.
Just two comments, small comments, regarding the combination of thiazide diuretics and high ceiling diuretics. In the CLIC trial, it has been shown that those patients who had add-on therapy, those patients who used to have high ceiling diuretics and then they were started on chlorthalidone, they had a relatively lower GFR and a reversible renal failure, reversible AKI. This is one. And secondly, sir, in India, hot and humid climate is one, but the interesting part is sweat is hypotonic. Sweat is hypotonic. So when we sweat much, then actually sodium tends to go up instead of go down. So that's the reason why we don't see that much of hyponatremia that we expect, because sweat itself is a hypotonic substance. So as we sweat, then the sodium tends to go up rather than it goes down.
Thank you, Abhijit. I know, JS, we're going to conclude. The combination of the diuretics, which is a very important topic, combining diuretics, is really under the realm of nephrologists. I don't think if you're not practicing nephrology, one should not try to use combination as an outpatient yourself, because there are multiple problems that can occur. But nephrologists use sometimes loop diuretics plus metalazone. They use loop diuretics plus chlorthalidone because they're seeing patients more frequently. But otherwise, it's a little bit risky to use it because it can have tremendous degree of this. Other thing, one comment I want to make is one of the common reasons for hyponatremia in the current age is excessive water drinking. People drink a lot of water. In a lot of water, there is bottled water in your pocket, there is bottled water in the car, there is bottled water in your bag, there is water bottle next to your laptop, and people are constantly drinking. And the nephrologists, whenever they see a patient with hyponatremia, the first thing they do is to cut down the water intake. They don't even check osmolality, nothing like that. You just cut down the water intake. So that is, keep it in mind that this kind of a water drinking, water bottles in all pockets and your backpack and everything, I think one should be very careful. Water you should drink with meals. Water you should drink when you're thirsty. Water you drink to swallow tablets or capsules. That is the indication for water intake. So, Jayesh, shall I just, shall we get concluding remarks?
Yes, it's for you. Yeah, it's
Okay.
your.
Again, I want to, I think Johnny will also talk. I want to thank the faculty, Dr. Cushman, Dr. Whelton, Dr. Jackson Wright, Dr. Mohan, Dr. Tarabdar, and of course, Jagdish, you for participating, because this is a wealth of clinical experience in terms of clinical practice and clinical trial. A lot of times people ask, show me the evidence, show me the evidence. I want more evidence. I want more evidence. Now you have the evidence. You have the clinical trialists, your experienced people, nephrologists, cardiologists, clinical pharmacologists, diabetologists, who should try to do what is right for the patient, apply the clinical trials, outcome trials to the given patient, so that's where this is called translational medicine, where you have to translate what has been found to the best benefit in the patient, utilizing your clinical acumen. So I want to tender my appreciation for all the faculty for participation in the meeting, and especially those Sunday evening here, Sunday morning in US, but I would appreciate the time taken. And I hope all those 5,000 attendees who have joined in, they will be able to apply the therapeutic advances and therapeutic knowledge to the ultimate patient benefit, because we are all here because tomorrow onwards, the only beneficiary of our dialogue and deliberation should always be the patient and their families. Dr. Parikh, wonderful clinical pharmacologist also, he has participated. And in fact, he's getting only one of the few clinical pharmacologists in the industry. He keeps on writing papers, publishes very, very heavily. So let me hand over the conclusion portion and way forward to Johnny Edwin. Johnny, I just saw you a minute ago. Okay, now please take over. And then after your remarks, it will be final and finale.
Thank you, sir. In fact, good evening to all the doctors. It's indeed a great pleasure on Sunday evening to be with you all for this wonderful academic feast. We at Ipca have been very, very active in all these academic initiatives. One such initiative was the 20th year of the ALLHAT trial, and we were glad enough to have the three principal investigators with us today, Dr. Jackson Wright, Dr. William Cushman, Sunday morning to be here, and of course, Dr. Venkata S for moderating the session wonderfully and been very instrumental in pointing this program for the event for today. Our heartfelt thanks to Dr. Jagdish sir, because right from the day we launched this molecule Chlorthalidone in 2011, of course, he was one of the instrumental in taking this awareness of ALLHAT trial and of course all the trials related to Chlorthalidone across the country. So thank you for your valuable presence in chairing the session today. It's a great honor to have Dr. V. Mohan sir with us. Of course, his contribution in the field of diabetology is immense. And again, when it comes to the clinical research aspects, yes, he's very, very instrumental. Initially, as he mentioned, when we approached him, he said, Johnny, what I'm going to do with this ALLHAT per se. But yes, the investigation, the initiatives and the approach towards all the clinical trials in India, which he has been doing, has been immense and a commendable job, and has been awarded rewarded with many such accomplishments for the clinical research. And so thank you for your valuable contribution and your expert comments for today. It's a great honor to have Dr. Abhijit Tirupdar sparing his full time today for us And of course, very, very impressive with this valuable comments, sir. Thanks a lot for your valuable comments and being present over here. And this same program was telecast across almost 76 centers. And our heartfelt thanks to all the chairpersons and the panelists for this place who have been there. And we had almost like 1,800 logged doctors who were physically present, and plus, I mean, almost close to 2,000 plus doctors physically present, and almost 2,000 doctors who were already on the, or who had logged in through the viewership. So our heartfelt thanks to all the doctors on Sunday evening, and thank you. Thanks a lot.
Okay, sign off, and
Thank you, everyone.
thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.